one knew that behind the screaming voice of Australia's most iconic rocker was a child who once begged for death. Before he stood under the blinding lights of stadiums, before the roar of fans and the thunder of guitars, Jimmy Barnes was just a boy hiding in fear from his drunken father, from the fists flying in the kitchen, from the shadows of a family drowning in violence and poverty. And it wasn't until decades later, when the rock star finally sat down to write, that the world discovered a truth more harrowing than any song he ever sang. In a land that prides itself on resilience and grit, Jimmy Barnes became a symbol of working-class strength. But few knew just how dark that strength was forged. "I was lucky to survive," he admitted, not in metaphor, but in brutal honesty. His memoir, Working Class Boy, ripped open wounds that had never healed. Of a Scottish immigrant family torn by alcoholism, of a boy raised in the slums of Elizabeth, South Australia, where crime, despair, and silence ruled. The public adored the performer, but were stunned by the child who had been screaming all along, not in melody, but in pain. This is not just the story of a music legend. It is a journey into the haunted corridors of his past, where survival was not glamorous and fame never erased the trauma. Behind the platinum records, there was always the boy in the corner, waiting for someone to save him. No one did, so he saved himself, and then he sang. Jimmy Barnes was not born into fame. He was born into chaos. Long before he became the gravel-voiced frontman of Cold Chisel or the chart-topping solo artist embraced by millions, he was James Dixon Swan, a frightened child in the industrial wastelands of post-war Glasgow. Born in 1956 to a family teetering on the edge of collapse, he was the fifth of 6 children in a crumbling Scottish household where alcohol flowed more freely than love. But the nightmare didn't truly begin until 1962, when his family migrated to Australia in search of a better life, and instead found themselves trapped in a different kind of hell. They landed in Elizabeth, a northern suburb of Adelaide built to house migrants and working-class families. On the surface, it was a promise of opportunity. But beneath the modest homes and wide streets lay a community battling poverty, isolation, and rage. For young Jimmy, it was a pressure cooker, a daily war zone of screaming parents, violent fights, and emotional abandonment. His father, Jim Swan, drank heavily and struck with fists more often than words. His mother, Dorothy, tried to hold the family together, but the cracks widened with every night of terror. By the age of 5, Jimmy had already seen more than most adults ever would. He witnessed brutal assaults in his own home. He cowered in closets, trying to make himself invisible. He stole food to survive and carried a knife before he was 10. His world was one of blunt trauma, physical, emotional, psychological. But there was no language for trauma in working-class Australia. Boys were told to toughen up. Pain was weakness. Silence was survival. And so he turned inward. He found brief refuge in music. First in the jukeboxes that blared the Beatles and Otis Redding, then in the raw energy of pub rock, where loudness could drown memory. He wasn't born a rock star. He escaped into one. The moment he joined a band, it wasn't about fame, it was about escape. Music was the only place where he had control, where his voice could finally be louder than the violence that had shaped him. But the trauma didn't vanish. It followed him into adulthood, into the studios and stages. It whispered in hotel rooms, screamed in hangovers, and bled into relationships. The very rage that powered his performances came from a place so dark that he himself often didn't understand it. For years, fans saw him as a powerhouse, the embodiment of Australian masculinity. But they didn't see the internal collapse, the spirals of addiction, or the nightmares that refused to let go. It wasn't until decades later, after Cold Chisel had broken up, after solo success, after children, after breakdowns, that Jimmy Barnes decided to tell the truth. Not just about the music, but about the boy. The forgotten child inside him, the one he had hidden behind whiskey bottles and power chords. And in doing so, he did something few rock legends ever dared. He turned the spotlight inward. This story is not about the rise to fame. It is about the price paid in silence. The pain buried beneath the national icon, and the desperate, defiant boy who refused to disappear. In the bleak streets of Elizabeth, where most kids vanished into factories or the justice system, Jimmy Barnes found something else. Noise. It started as a murmur, a pulse. Then came a scream. The scream that would carry him through decades of music, of survival, of reinvention. But in those early years, it wasn't music that saved him. It was sheer instinct. He drank to numb himself, fought to defend himself, and played loud to forget himself. He was spiraling before he ever had a chance to stand still. His first taste of stage life came in his teenage years when he joined a band called Fraternity. But it wasn't until he replaced a singer in a group called Cold Chisel that the transformation truly began. With Don Walker's poetic rage and Barnes' raw, volcanic voice, Cold Chisel wasn't just a band, it was a national movement. Pub rock, gritty and electric, became the soundtrack of suburban struggle. And Jimmy Barnes became its prophet. Shirtless, sweat-drenched, and screaming at the heavens, he sang the truth of the working class in a way no one had before. Songs like Quezon, Cheap Wine, and Choir Girl turned Cold Chisel into icons, but Jimmy himself remained dangerously untamed. As the band rose, so did the chaos inside him. He drank excessively. He fought violently. He became both myth and menace. Fame did not bring peace. It intensified the storm. His performances were catharsis. Each show was an exorcism. But when the lights went down, the ghosts returned. He once admitted, "I was either going to sing or die." By 1983, Cold Chisel disbanded, burned out by internal friction and Jimmy's unrelenting volatility. But Barnes wasn't finished. He launched a solo career with the fury of a man possessed. His debut album, Body Swerve, went straight to #1. So did the next, For the Working Class Man, cementing his role not just as a rock singer, but as the beating heart of Australia's identity. Rough, flawed, indestructible. His image became larger than life. He was the working man's Elvis, the laborer's Springsteen. Yet behind the glory was a man unraveling. The demons of his youth still haunted him. Success amplified his addictions. He drank until blackout, partied until collapse. He lashed out at those closest to him. Marriages strained. His children watched their father rage and disappear. The public cheered for the fire, never knowing how close he was to being consumed by it. There were overdoses, near-death experiences, moments when even Jimmy didn't know how or why he was still alive. Despite it all, he kept climbing. The 1990s brought more solo hits, more tours, more albums, but the music began to change. It wasn't just defiance anymore, it was confession. Songs started to carry the weight of memory. The boy inside him, once buried beneath guitar riffs and bravado, began to whisper through the cracks. It all built to a moment he hadn't planned, the decision to write it down. Not a rock memoir full of backstage stories, but a raw, brutal recollection of his childhood. Working Class Boy, released in 2016, stunned the nation. The rock god took off the armor and exposed the scars. And for the first time, people saw the man, not the myth. The boy hiding behind the microphone, the child who had survived what many would not. That book changed everything. It wasn't just a bestseller. It became a phenomenon. Jimmy Barnes, the last person anyone expected to speak about trauma, opened the door for an entire country to confront its silence. He had risen, fallen, and risen again, not through fame, but through truth. When Working Class Boy hit the shelves, it didn't just peel back the curtain, it tore the entire stage down. Australia had worshipped Jimmy Barnes for decades, but no one expected what lay beneath the rock and roll armor. In a voice stripped of metaphor, Jimmy detailed an existence that was closer to war than childhood. The public gasped, but Jimmy did not flinch. "I had to write it," he said. "Otherwise, I wouldn't survive." The stories were not glamorous. They were horrifying. At 6 years old, he watched his father beat his mother bloody. He saw his siblings brutalized, his home shattered by poverty and alcohol. He lived in fear of the night and sometimes of waking up at all. He ran with street gangs, drank heavily before his teenage years, and carried a blade to protect himself. He was molested by a man when he was a boy. A truth he had buried so deep, he didn't even speak it until the book was nearly complete. And perhaps most heartbreakingly, he carried the guilt of feeling invisible, unloved, and abandoned by the very people who were meant to keep him safe. The public response was immediate and conflicted. Fans were moved to tears. Critics hailed the memoir as one of the most important autobiographies ever written by an Australian artist. Survivors of trauma found their own stories mirrored in his words. But others were stunned. Some questioned why a rock legend would air such deeply personal pain. Some accused him of exploiting the past. But Jimmy Barnes didn't care. "I'm not doing this for sympathy," he said. "I'm doing it to heal." The healing wasn't just for himself. For the first time, Jimmy began talking openly about mental illness. He admitted to suicidal thoughts, to overdosing, to crying alone in hotel rooms. He described the crushing weight of PTSD, not from war, but from childhood. He revealed that the energy that made him a powerhouse on stage was, in fact, the same energy that nearly destroyed him off it. "I was trying to outrun the kid inside me," he confessed in an interview. But he was always there. What set Jimmy apart wasn't that he suffered. It was that he refused to lie about it anymore. On stage, he still roared. But now, he also whispered truths that most men of his generation were taught to bury. He became not just a rock icon, but a voice for those who never thought they'd be heard. His music changed too. Later albums like My Criminal Record carried a different tone, weary, wiser, scarred but standing. Songs like Shutting Down Our Town felt less like anthems and more like testimonies. Barnes wasn't escaping anymore. He was remembering and surviving. He didn't stop with one book. Working Class Man, the sequel, chronicled his years as a rock star and his spiral into addiction. Together, the two books painted a complete portrait, not just of an artist, but of a man grappling with the wreckage left behind by violence, silence, and survival. And through it all, he never pretended to be a hero. He told the story exactly as it was, brutal, ugly, but true. The impact rippled across the country. Mental health organizations praised his bravery. Schools invited him to speak. Survivors reached out by the thousands. And in doing so, Jimmy Barnes, once the loudest voice in Australian rock, did something even louder. He helped break the silence of a nation. Because in the end, the darkest truth wasn't what happened to Jimmy. It was that no one asked, no one saw, no one stopped it, until he told them. There are few figures in Australian music as iconic or as brutally honest as Jimmy Barnes. At Aussie Uncovered, we've told stories of fame, downfall, redemption, and scandal. But Jimmy Barnes stands apart, not simply because of his voice or his decades of success, but because of his courage to turn that success inside out. He didn't hide behind the myth of the rocker. He dismantled it, piece by piece, word by word, song by song. What makes Jimmy Barnes truly legendary is not that he sold more albums than almost any other Australian artist. It's not the sold-out stadiums, or the countless hit records, or the way Cold Chisel became the soundtrack of a generation. It's the fact that he survived what should have killed him, and then used that survival to help others. That takes a different kind of strength, one that can't be taught in studios or rehearsed on stage. Barnes's journey is the kind we rarely see told so openly. A story of inherited trauma, generational silence, and emotional resurrection. He challenged the toxic myths of masculinity that said men shouldn't cry, shouldn't speak, shouldn't remember. He reminded Australia that working class pride doesn't mean hiding your pain. It means confronting it and rising anyway. Some critics still see him as a hard-drinking rocker from a bygone era, but we see something else. We see a man who turned pain into melody, who found redemption not in awards, but in truth. A man who stood on stage with the ghosts of his past and said, "I'm still here." In an industry built on image, Jimmy Barnes gave us honesty. And in doing so, he gave voice to thousands who never had the words. At Aussie Uncovered, we believe that stories like this matter, not just because they're shocking, but because they're real. Jimmy's tale is raw, imperfect, unpolished, like the man himself. And maybe that's why it resonates so deeply. Because for all his fame, Jimmy Barnes never stopped being that working class boy, singing not just for applause, but for survival. We'd love to hear what you think. What did Jimmy Barnes mean to you growing up? Did working class boy change the way you saw him? How many of us carry scars like his, silent, buried, waiting to be heard? Let's talk about it. Some voices echo long after the final note fades. Jimmy Barnes carries one of those voices, not just in music, but in memory. For many Australians, he wasn't just the sound of a generation. He was the sound of home, of resilience, of something raw and unfiltered. But now, knowing where that voice came from, the broken houses, the silent cries, the trembling hands of a boy left to fend for himself, that sound hits different. It cuts deeper. His story is no longer just about Cold Chisel or chart-topping albums. It's about the kid behind the eyes, the small figure in a dark hallway, waiting for the yelling to stop. It's about how trauma doesn't disappear with fame. It lingers, it waits, and sometimes it sings. There's something hauntingly beautiful in how Jimmy turned agony into art, not for spectacle, not for sympathy, but for truth. He gave us permission to ask hard questions about our families, our silence, our own shadows. In a country that's so often afraid to talk about pain, Jimmy Barnes opened the door and walked through it first. And now, when we hear Kesan, or working class man, we don't just hear rock anthems. We hear survival. We hear defiance. We hear a man who should have been destroyed by his past, but instead chose to sing louder than it. Some stories are never told, but now you know. Jimmy Barnes didn't just leave a mark on Australian music. He carved a scar into its heart, one that still pulses, still aches, and still reminds us of what it means to rise from the ruins.